And live from Mumbai and Brussels, it's ZN Live. That's right. I'm very excited to be here all the way from Mumbai. I'm Phil Weiss, your host, and I have a very special guest today, Mark Dober. I've known Mark for a very long time. Mark is an experienced professional. He's been in many different companies, including APCO, Hill and Knowlton, and he's got his own recruitment agency, and he publishes the very respected Best in Brussels guide, where you can find all the things you need to know about agencies and about associations and latest trends. So it's fantastic to have you on the show. And the other thing you need to know about Mark is that he has 5 black belts in judo, karate, jiu-jitsu, and Brazilian judo, I think. So you want to have him in a dark alley, well, with you in case anything happens. So welcome to the show, Mark. Great to have you. And I want to start with a question about, what's happening in the recruitment space in Brussels. I know you've been quite busy. What are you seeing as the biggest kind of changes that are affecting your industry right now?
Thank you, Philip, and hello, everybody. Nice to speak to you from not so glamorous Forêt. So, in response to your question, in terms of the recruitment market right now, well, I'm happy to say that it's still hot. Counterintuitively, over the last 3 years, even during the worst of the pandemic, we were very busy recruiting people. And frankly, that was because everybody needed to engage with their stakeholders, they needed to engage with the EU, they needed to engage with the media. And so it was all hands on deck, and there was a real focus on Brussels. And so, for instance, ironically, if you speak to real estate agents who serve the EU quota right now, there's a real lack of office space because organizations have moved in. The latest stats from Transparency International say there are 48,000 lobbyists in Brussels now, which compares to 10,000 when I first came here 30 years ago. So that's tremendous growth, and the market is still growing. It's maybe cooling down a little bit, and I think we see some sectors where there've even been a few minor layoffs, unfortunately for the people concerned. But some of the tech companies, some of the fintech companies, but for the most part. Organizations are beefing up and have grown tremendously in the last 3 years. And we've been recruiting positions for big companies that weren't previously here, like MSC Shipping, General Motors, etc.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think this is one part of the EU market, which is it tends to be counter-cyclical. You're not always, you can sometimes grow when no one else is, and not be particularly affected by some kind of boom period, because it's a question of legislation and needs. Now, you've actually been yourself an early pioneer in digital. I remember you telling me that you worked with APCO on their first digital campaigns. And I want to ask you a little bit about the profile of the people you're recruiting. And before we go into the profile, I also want to ask you, what is happening? You said office space is in demand. What is the balance between remote and in office now? There's been a huge push to bring people back in the office. That's been the big narrative in all the kind of press, saying every company is pulling everybody back. Is that happening in Brussels? Are people liking it?
Well, it depends who you talk to. Last month, we recruited a position where they only had to turn up to the office 1 day a month. That's unusual. I think there is a growing expectation for people to spend a bit more time in the office than they were previously, at least 3 days, I guess, as a rule of thumb. But there are roles which require more than that, ideally, and there are some that require less than that. I think it's subject to negotiation or a policy, and it really depends on the organization. I mean, if you're a sole lobbyist in Brussels representing a big company, it's up to you how you manage your time, really. So no one's watching you punch in the clock to go to the office. But if you're in a consultancy, and I see some very different practices. I know one where the leader told me he'd like his staff in 5 days a week. And I understand that, having been a senior consultant myself, there's a dynamic that happens when people are together, creativity, working together. You need a team, you need to be in the same space, ideally, which can be online, admittedly. Other organizations are very relaxed. it also comes down to personalities, and some leaders are a bit more controlling, let's say, than others.
So you're not seeing a very clear cut trend. I mean, we're at ZN, we're working remotely very happily, fully embraced it since the pandemic. We have
Yeah.
over 130 people who work very effectively, but I think it requires some very good digital systems and training. So are you seeing the bosses wanting everybody in the room and the employees saying we'd like more flexibility? What's the trend?
I'm reminded, I mean, you're an early adopter and you're a pioneer and you figured this out, and it probably works a little bit better because of the nature of the services that you're providing. You're not manufacturing goods or whatever. I'm reminded of Intel was an early adopter on home working, and they did a study which was related to how many taps there were on the keyboard. And what they found was that on Fridays and Mondays, there was significantly less taps on the keyboard. So basically, people were going to the office on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and having kind of long weekends and working a lot less. So they actually kind of did them. This was before the pandemic, asked people to spend more time in the office again. And I think you see, from Tesla and many of the other companies, particularly in the US, are really asking their employees to go back 5 days a week. I think we have quite a different culture here in Europe and specifically in Belgium, where there are rules about how this should be done, and everybody's getting policies in place. I think it really depends on your culture. I mean, I think what you and I have probably observed, and many of the people who are listening to this, is that you can be more productive at home, right? You don't have those interruptions and those kind of wasted conversations and less office politics. You can really sit down and focus on a deliverable. So I think for consultancy work, particularly, I think it's remote working can be a huge boon. But then you've always got the challenge, and I discovered this the hard way. A team only exists when you meet. So I'm gonna be curious on your findings on that, and how you do that in a virtual context and make it human and effective.
Yeah, I think there are two really important aspects to that. The first one is you can't go remote without having a strategy, training, and culture and tools in place. So it takes a lot of work to make sure that that works effectively. So it's not just, oh, go home and do a few calls from time to time. You need everyone to have information. You need a meeting flow that allows people to regularly check in. You need communication to be very open. You need people to really use the tools they have effectively. And the second thing is you need to focus on the outputs. So you're not, and this to me is actually something I've always found incredibly frustrating in a traditional office, is people, they work in a kind of in a demonstrative way. It's like, look at me, I'm working super late, I'm working hard, I'm typing on the keyboard so Intel knows I'm working. This is not work. This is just acting as if you were working. The question I think every manager has to ask is, what is your output? And what we've been focused on with our team is like, look, you have client projects, this is your output, this is what we're looking at, this is what we're measuring. you know Actual deliverables, client satisfaction, profitability. We measure those things, and it's up to you to figure out the best way to do it. So for me, that's the key thing. And we had our 25th anniversary in September, in a beautiful venue. We're sharing a lot of things about this. It was great, and the team is incredibly bonded. I think actually we have one of the strongest cultures we've had in the company for a long time, and it's not because of an office. Of course, these people work from all over Europe. They really like the getting together, and we do that a couple of times a year. A lot of people also meet in between. Nothing stops you from visiting people, having a couple of meetings, etc. But I've seen so many toxic office cultures that were living together in the same space, and I believe that in a lot of dynamics, it creates the opposite result. You end up with people who have to focus their entire, when they come to the office, they think like, oh, am I going to talk to that person, avoid that person, pretend to work really hard. And again, it's kind of, there's so much of that acting that takes place. And once you don't have the office, well, it's actually about the work. So that's my thing. Actually, we have a comment from Justin saying,
Hello, I think we've just lost Philip, if I'm not mistaken. Philip, are you able to join back again?
I'm back. I
There you
actually
go.
I tapped on the wrong button, so that was very interesting. I exited myself, but we had a comment from Justin saying how in Korea and Japan, people have these very intense work culture. Um, and just coming back to you on this, I think one of the other changes we've seen, in addition to remote working, is more freelance work. So people are not necessarily employed for kind of ongoing periods, but more on a project basis or contractual basis. What are you seeing in the job market in terms of looking for freelance? I know that certain jobs in Brussels, even if they're almost like employment, they often prefer the contractual arrangements of a company. But have you seen any real changes there?
Not substantially. I think it depends again on the sector of the market that we're talking about. For companies, so multinational corporates, I would say more than 99% of people working in those environments are salaried employees, so they're not independent contractors. I'm talking in the kind of functions we're talking about, communications and public
Hmm.
affairs. For trade associations, I would say the vast majority of people are still salaried employees, with the exception of trade association leaders, many of whom, around 25%, according to our research, which you can find on our website on Dober Partners Insights section, along with the Best in Brussels report and other research. About 25% of them are independents. And frankly, that's because of this crazy tax situation that we're all familiar with if we live in Belgium. Regarding consultants, yes, I would say the vast majority of senior consultants are employed on an independent basis. Again, because of tax reasons, it just makes a win-win situation. And if you've seen Best in Brussels, we have a top 220 public affairs consultants, so not so much on the communications market, but I would say the vast majority of those, probably 90% plus, are independents. So in those environments, yes. If they're project oriented, I think that would be more in your kind of environment where you're looking to tap specific expertise and perhaps not all the time, perhaps search engine optimization or something like that, where you have a real expert who perhaps has multiple clients and perhaps their primary consultancy client is ZN. So I think in your environment, yes, but I would say in the broader Brussels bubble, no. And there may be some tax changes, as my accountant tells me, to stop independents working for one organization. There's been rumblings of that for years. I don't know if that will happen because there might be a mini revolution, I think, in certain quarters.
For sure. And I think what we're seeing is that the freelance model gives you a different mindset and a different level of flexibility.
Yeah,
As you said, people working on multiple projects. If you combine that with remote, it means I work from wherever I want. I choose my time. I am an entrepreneur, and I kind of decide on things.
yeah,
I see this as a growing trend in the long term. I think for people who are older, it's a bit more difficult to adjust to that. But I
mm,
think for people entering and seeing
yeah.
opportunities, it gives them a lot of flexibility. And talking about this, when you meet young people who enter the job market or who are coming to Brussels for the first time, what is your kind of worldly wisdom? And what do you tell them that they need to do to be successful?
Well, I think the number one thing I tell my kids, and I tell anyone really, is do what you enjoy. Because I think when you do what you enjoy, you'll tend to be very good at it, and it will seem less like work. And when you do something you don't enjoy, I mean, I tried banking, for instance, for a year. It was probably the worst year of my life. I hated it, and I was no good at it. But I found a passion for public affairs and communications because I was fascinated by it. And I think if you're working in this environment in the Brussels bubble, what a privilege. And most people we survey are extremely happy with the job choices that they've chosen in Brussels. So you're probably on the right path, but do what you enjoy. Um, if we're talking about the Brussels market, I think there's a rather specific thing going on here, which is unfortunately, most of the money is in public affairs. and I know there's a big gray space between what is communications and what is public affairs, but if I look at salaries, for instance, and I look at the leadership of trade associations, or I see who represents companies here, for the most part, they are public affairs people. Um, Now, I think they should develop communication skills. So I think if you're asking me a question, what should I say to a young communicator? I would say go deep on your communication skills, read theory and practice, do some interesting things that I had the privilege of doing perhaps when I was younger, which was like opinion polling, for instance, is a fascinating skill to learn and something I'm still able to use today in the research that we do. Messaging, I think, is really, really important to understand what makes a good message, because organizations can get really lost on how many messages they should have and make coming through with a clear one, two, or three strong messages. So I think all of those things are important. And coming back to my earlier point, figure out public affairs if you're in a communications role, because most of the communications roles in the Brussels bubble, at least, are in support of public affairs or policy goals. That makes sense?
Yeah, no. So I think enjoying, pick something you enjoy. I think that's definitely good advice. Uh, Build communication skills in depth, and if you're looking for a job in Brussels, have some strong public affairs knowledge and even
Mhm.
experience, because that
Yeah.
will get you, better pay. So I think that's a good. Are there any specific skills that you think people need today? Beyond just the public affairs ones, when they start their career today.
Um, I think at the end of the day, whether you're a communicator or a public affairs person, it's all about getting the right information to the right people at the right time, right? So I think the skill set underpins all of that. So there are things you can learn, I think, from a knowledge
Mm.
perspective about what is the right information, which may mean studying things that I find dreadfully boring, like comitology, but it might be important in your role. um, and then figuring out how you translate that into meaningful language for your organization that doesn't send them to sleep. So
Mhm.
I think there's lots of skills there. There's a whole other dimension to this, which is, and I see this from my client side, which is for most jobs, skills are a given, right? So if you're competing for a job, you know what the skills you need, and they're written on the job description. I think everybody on this webinar broadly has an idea of what skills they have and maybe the ones they need to work on and what are necessary to go forward in their career. But what I can tell you is what really sets apart the average candidate from the good candidates and the really good candidates that get the job, the personality. And that has to do with also demonstrating a certain degree of passion and motivation in an interview. I read research. I'm not sure it's true, but it's an interesting observation, and I have witnessed it counting a lot. Is that motivation is the number one reason people get jobs. So I mean, if you've got people with equal skills sitting in an interview, and then somebody comes in and says they really want this job and they have a passion for what they do, and they're exciting, then that person is going to get the job. So I think those things, some of those soft skills, personality attributes, are also things to think about and to work on.
Yeah, and I think it's all about also getting exposure and practicing your networking skills, and basically connecting with people and being able to tell them a story and showing your
Yeah,
skills at the same time, and expressing your passion, which I think doesn't come naturally to a lot of people. So you need to
yeah.
be conscious on how to do that. Now, you are obviously the man behind the Best in Brussels guide. So tell
Mhm.
us in a nutshell, what is in that guide and why does everybody need one by their bedside table?
Well, probably put it by your office table rather than your bedside table. There's probably some more interesting reading for before you go to sleep. But I think I mean, the concept for it was to provide something useful for clients, because I kept getting asked by clients across many sectors, from financial services to healthcare to tech, is, you're a headhunter, Mark. Can you advise me on who are the top two or three agencies in this particular sector or in this particular field? And I realized that there was no resource for them. It was all kind of word of mouth. and that didn't really necessarily represent a full picture. And I've only really begun to, really understand at a deeper level the nature of the top providers in Brussels. And there's some amazing people, some amazing firms doing great work every day in Brussels. And so the other side of that was to also help those organizations showcase a little bit for what they do. So to connect clients and service providers. And I didn't know it was going to work in 2019 when we launched, but I was surprised at the level of support we got even in our first year when we had about 50 organizations showcased there, and now we have about 100. And I think we've tapped into a client need. And I think for anybody who's interested in the Brussels service market as well, it's an interesting read and an interesting click through. I also get emails from people who found jobs that way and say, "Oh, thanks for Best in Brussels. I applied for this agency and they offered me a job." There's multiple uses for it, but it was intended for clients. But I think it's actually got a broader application now.
Yeah, and I think it's very comprehensive. I mean, you spend time trying to reorganize, who's doing what, when, and then you also have this very useful trends section. So I strongly recommend people to check it out. And of course, we're very happy to be the leading digital agency. We've also recently been referred to by Politico as the OJ of digital agencies. So we're probably going to print a T-shirt with that on it. But now we have time for some recommendations.
Is that OJ Official Journal or OJ Orange Juice?
No. Original Gangster. So that's
oh, the OG. Right.
The OG.
Okay,
OG. Sorry, my pronunciation. Yeah.
Now I'm learning.
Okay. Roll jingle for our recommendations. So this is the moment when we ask you for your recommendations for books and podcasts that you suggest our what viewers could listen to, could check out. So, Mark, what is your recommendation to our viewers?
In terms of reading a good book, I can recommend Made to Stick if you haven't read it. It's written by Professor Chip Heath from Stanford and his brother, and it gives a formula for making powerful, sticky messages. So messages that will stick and that you will remember, both as a messenger and as someone receiving the message. So I can strongly recommend that. Oh, wow. What does that say?
One step ahead. Sorry,
one step ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to stick into people's heads.
Right. Okay. Well, hopefully that's stuck. And if I'm allowed a second, something I do probably too much, according to my wife, is I listen to audiobooks. So I have an Audible account, and there's a group of university lectures, top level, for very cost effective to download, and they're on some fascinating subjects for communicators, whether they're psychology or communications themselves, or I end up listening to a lot of medieval history, but there are some amazing courses on there. I can strongly recommend it.
You mean the Great Courses part of Audible?
Yeah, it's called The Great Courses, and they're university lectures, usually about 24 or sometimes 36 on a particular subject. So there are ones there on communications, they're there on psychology and behavioral psychology, which I think is important for communicators to get their head around.
Yeah, no, absolutely fascinating. I'm a big fan. It's now called Wondrium. They have their own app. And so basically they still run their courses through Audible. I also am a huge fan of Audible. I'm almost finished the biography of Elon Musk, which is a fascinating listen. And I love listening to other things on Audible as well. My recommendation is actually a travel one. I was in Athens just a few days ago, visited the Acropolis. There's a not brand new, but a done-up museum of the Acropolis, which is fantastic. You can have a coffee watching the Acropolis, and you can also see the original sculptures and get the story behind the Acropolis. So definitely worth a visit if you are going through Athens. So that's all we have time for today. Have a fantastic weekend, and we will see you online on LinkedIn, on X Twitter, on Instagram, on Blue Sky, or wherever you spend your time online. So thank you, Mark, and see you around.
Thank you.
Bye.